Welcome all to Culturati Live. I'm Misty Wild. For those joining us for the first time, Culturati is a community that convenes leaders, scholars, and practitioners for candid conversations around culture, leadership, trust, AI, and the future of work. Our belief has always been that we can change the world through the workplace together. Now, many of you may have heard that we will not host our annual Culturati Summit in 2027. We're taking a deliberate pause as we consider what Culturati's next chapter might be and scale back some of our work in the interim. But conversations like today's remain important to us, and we're grateful that you have chosen to be a part of this one. With distributed teams today, one of the most difficult challenges leaders face is whether we can recognize cultural dynamics and respond effectively in the moment. Cultural awareness gives us insight, but it's cultural agility that determines what we can do about it. Today's session moves us beyond awareness into practice, exploring how cultural agility can become a repeatable leadership capability rather than something we rely on instinct or personality to provide. And our guide for that work today is Dr. Joy Wiggins. Joy is a cultural agility consultant, keynote speaker, and author who helps senior leaders and global teams turn cultural difference into measurable advantage. She is the creator of the Cultural Agility Change Model and the author of From Sabotage to Support, a new vision for feminist solidarity in the workplace. Before moving into consulting, Joy was a professor at Western Washington University and the University of Texas at Arlington. She holds a PhD in Language, Education, and Society from Ohio State University, and her work brings together rigorous research and practical experience across corporate, academic, and cross-border settings. Originally from Texas, Joy now lives and works in Portugal, advising organizations navigating an increasingly global and distributed workforce. Joy, thank you so much for being here and for bringing this application to the Culturati community. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you Misty and Annie and Eugene for having me. I'm really excited. I've heard about Culturati for a long time. I've watched a lot of your webinars and everything, so I've been following you all for a while, so I really appreciate this opportunity. So first, what I would love to do is to see where everybody is from, where you're calling in from. As Misty said, I'm calling in from Lisbon, Portugal. It's about 6 o'clock here, so I would love to see in the chat just where everybody is calling from. What country, what cities are you in? And I'm going to ask you all to do a lot of things with the chat. So have that open to the side and you'll be able to quickly answer questions and things like that. Okay, let me get started. Oh, Kansas City. Let me see where everybody's from. New York, I love it. Fort Lauderdale. In Austin, Tyler. So I lived in Austin for 4 years before moving to Portugal. So I am very familiar with Austin. I miss the tacos. So I have my daughter getting the spices from HEB to bring back to Portugal. So if anybody is coming to Portugal, I would probably ask you to bring some taco seasoning. So anyway, let me get started. And thank you all for being here. All right, so hopefully you will see my screen. And Misty, can you tell me if it shows just my screen?
I can see all of it at the moment, so you might want to
Okay.
do.
All right. This is why I don't do the whole thing. So let me just open it up a little bit. Okay, let me go back. All right, so this is called From Insights to Instinct. I'm going to keep my chat so I can also kind of monitor what you all are saying. If anybody can't see it, please let me know. Tortillas from HEB, Eugene, yes, they're amazing. All right, so this is talking about cultural agility on global teams. So in the chat, just let me know, are you working with like a really diverse team? Tell me a little bit about maybe your organization, and I'll just kind of be looking at the chat as I'm going through the presentation. So really cultural agility is, if you think about what it means to be agile, you think about being nimble and you can kind of read a situation and move with it and adapt to it, right? So that's really what cultural agility is. And it's cultivating a critical skill. It's much like emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence. It's kind of bringing all those things together to see how do we move with international teams, people that work from all over the world. You're probably working with teams that are in different countries around the world. There might be some miscommunications, some missteps, some just kind of two ships in the night, not quite really understanding each other. So cultural agility is really to help you with that. All right. So in the chat, or actually we have a poll. When was the last time a cultural miscommunication left you rethinking how you handled it? Did something happen this week, maybe this month, maybe sometime this year? Or maybe you have one from like years ago that haunts you still. So go ahead and vote in there. What we'll give you about a minute or two and just think about what it was just, something that might be like bothering you still, or maybe you're just like, I don't know, there's something going on. Great. Yeah, I'm reading the comments. All right, so go ahead and do that. I had one just today. All right, and can we show the results? Wow, okay, sometime this year, this month, this week. Awesome. All right. So when we think about cultural agility and coming back to like cultural misunderstandings, a lot of times there's a few things going on, right? So there's a lot of research actually around this. And what the work that I was doing as a professor was really looking at culture, language, and policies. The work that I did at JLL was really looking at content and research around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I thought I would do is I'm like, I love the principles of DEI, but then I also really love intercultural communication and cross-cultural communication. So how do I meld those two together? So it took me about 2 years to really come up with this cultural agility change model. And so a couple things that have come out of it is cultural intelligence, like reading an unfamiliar room and adjusting is a skill that you can learn. It's not a personality, right? So just think about this as like any skill. We also look at language and inclusion. So when English is the working language, but it might be people's second, third, and fourth language that they're working in. I was just last week, I was at it was a Belgian presenter who lives and works in the Netherlands presenting to a Portuguese audience. And so what was happening was one person in the room did not understand English. And I guess they didn't tell the other people in the room that this presentation was going to be in English. So it became this big kind of kerfuffle. And I was like, oh, there was another story for me. So every day it's always something, especially here in Lisbon. There's always, teams that are having issues. Somebody didn't quite understand what somebody else meant. There was kind of a misstep in the process. There's all kinds of things that happen when we don't quite have that cultural intelligence skill. And I say cultural intelligence and the skill because you have to have that mindset, but you also have to develop a skill of learning how to ask questions and things like that. So we'll get into all that. The other thing is to look at feedback. And when we think about feedback and disagreement, so Aaron Meyer talks about the culture map, how people give feedback, decide, and disagree. And that differs by cultures, right? So for me, I'm, in a great area where I've got people from Ukraine, from Russia, from Iran, from Norway, from Germany, Slovenia, Poland. I've got friends from all over. And it's really interesting to watch the way all of us communicate and what is considered polite and what is not considered polite, and some of the missteps along the way. So in the chat, which of these three do you think that would help you the most right now? And I'm just going to kind of read it a little bit. So what do you think would help you? Feedback and disagreement? Yeah, that's a big one. And when we talk about feedback and disagreement, we'll actually do a little practice on that. So we'll come back to that one. Okay, I'm seeing if you want to thumbs up some of people's. So I'll keep coming back to the chat to see. Language inclusion, yeah. So the other thing is that sometimes people think, oh, it's our process, it's our protocols, it's things like that that are getting in the way. But that might not necessarily be why you're having this miscommunication. It might be a cultural problem. It might be about identity, power, and unwritten rules of who gets heard and who does not get heard. And so maybe a new process won't necessarily really address the cultural problem because that's more the foundation. That's the underlying issue that's probably causing a rip in the process. So when we think about a, really looking at the cultural problem, and then we can fix the process problem. So the cultural problem might be something around communication. It might be that some people thought they were going to take over part of the project, and then other people thought, no, I was going to take over the project, and then it gets lost in translation, literally. So in the chat, think of one that went sideways recently for you. Was it process or culture or both? So the process might be like the handoff was broken, there was a badly run meeting, maybe everybody was talking about the solution, but we never came to a solution. That's a very French way of doing things. There's a lot of collaboration, a lot of talk, but there's not necessarily always a solution at the end. And that can frustrate Americans sometimes, or people that are direct, or people that are maybe type A, maybe linear thinkers. They don't necessarily have patience for the whole collaboration and the roundabout process. And so sometimes, it's our personalities, it's the cultures that we were brought up in. Maybe that's, the country that we were brought up in, the work culture, our family dynamics. And I'll talk about that in a second. Like what is culture? Let's see, process, definitely culture problem. Okay. So one of the things that came out of looking at cultural agility is I have been fascinated with cultural identity my whole life. I lived in Germany as a child. I lived in China. I'm just fascinated with people and the way that we are socialized and the way we express ourselves and the way that we're shaped by all these social factors that create us and mold us how we are and how that changes over time. So our identities really are like kaleidoscopes, and they move, they change, they shift. You have the essential pieces and colors, which might be, your foundation of like the core of who you are, but your perspective might change depending on where you are in your life, in an organization, the way you view things now, the types of information that you're getting, things might change. So I'll give you an example. So this is a lot. But pick out like 3 identity pieces out of this kaleidoscope and figure out how do they affect you at work. So for me, I definitely think my neurodivergence definitely affects my work. It didn't as much when I was a professor because I could be really creative. It wasn't a linear process. Everything that we did, I was collaborating with the students. But when I went into the corporate atmosphere, I realized that my neurodivergence might actually be hindering me. And it didn't really occur to me that might be what's happening. The other thing that was happening too was, I might look at being a woman and whether or not I felt the need or the support to speak up. Sometimes, as an older woman too, I'm middle-aged now. So ageism is now coming up. That wasn't really a problem. Maybe when I was a brand new professor, ageism kind of came up because I was really young. I was 30 when I became a professor, so I wasn't that far from my students. But then now as I've gotten older, there's a lot of generational shifts that are happening. And there's a great thing that I'm doing with one of my clients around generational shifts in September. We're going to talk about how the Gen X and Alpha can get along better. So that's even part of our identities. Our health, sometimes if we get sick, we start to look at the healthcare system a little bit more. We start to realize what's good about it, what's bad about it, how we're affected by it. Maybe that wasn't something on our radar. So we shifted our kaleidoscope just a little bit. Every time we have a new experience, we're shifting the kaleidoscope. So every time that you are interacting with somebody and you're getting a different perspective, you are shifting your kaleidoscope just a bit. And, even now being an immigrant, I'm realizing like what that's like to navigate the streets of Portugal every day, not really knowing Portuguese. I'm learning, but it's not great. Most of the time, people speak English. But when I was in China, nobody spoke English except for my students. And I was in a small town of 1.5 million, which for China, that was small. And nobody really spoke English. So everything I did was navigating it through miming and everything else. So that really opened up an aperture for me. So for you all, what is most affecting you? So someone said age. Yeah, is there anything else? Maybe your geographic region. I know there was a big difference between Seattle and Texas. So we lived in Seattle for 10 years. Texas is a lot different. I'm a native Texan, so for me, I understood Texan. Our occupation. Yep. Also, the other thing that goes into this is your family dynamics and introverts versus extroverts. And I can't put everything on this chart, but there's so many different things that affect how we show up to work and what we are bringing with us. And if we are somebody that's conflict avoidant, or we're someone that has, maybe didn't grow up in the best household that communicated well. And so as you get into the workplace, you're realizing, oh my gosh, my communication could use some work. Or maybe I never knew how to deal with conflict. I didn't know how to address my feelings. I didn't know how to address someone in a respectful way. Or, there's all of these things. So that's that blend of that emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, and then cultivating a skill to allow you to be agile in any given situation. Okay, let's see what else. Belief system and communication. Yep. So the cultural agility change model it's 5 steps, and I can't do all of them today, but I will give you an inventory at the end that you can take a screenshot of, and you'll be able to kind of think about it a little bit more. So the first one is we always want to look at context. What history, identity, and power are shaping this moment? So going back to all of those identity factors that affect you and how you show up in any given day to work, and then your interaction with other people who are showing up in a particular way. So, what history, identity, and power are shaping this moment? The other thing to think about is your leadership role. So, me as a white woman, middle-aged, neurodivergent, there's a lot that I'm bringing with me. And then when I interact with somebody that doesn't really understand neurodivergence, or if I interact, sorry, the dog is growling. And if I interact with someone that, is neurotypical and maybe they don't really understand neurodivergence, or maybe it's somebody from a different generation. My daughter's Gen Alpha. So actually she's Gen Z, she's like right on the cusp, but there's a big difference between the generations too. So there might be lots going on in any given moment, any given meeting. So the other thing to look at too is alignment and framing. So whose definition of success is the invisible default? So when we think about what is success at work, for some people, it's climbing the corporate ladder. For some people, it's making sure you have work-life balance. And that's also a generational thing too. Gen Alpha, Gen Z is really looking at work-life balance a lot more than older generations. So that's a generational difference, right? Even cultural differences as far as countries. The Portuguese, we call it Portuguese time. And, I last week with that conference that I was in, they started 45 minutes late. So for me, as an American, I'm super on time and everything is about time. And that's not the case here in Portugal. So, and it's not the case in other countries either. And so I think, this idea of what success looks like, is it also giving direct or indirect feedback? What kinds of feedback are you giving? So much going on, right? So, but whose definition of success is actually going to look good on performance reviews, or to help you move up the corporate ladder, or to help you have a better relationship with your manager? All of these things, there are some hidden rules that maybe we don't know about. And so if we take a good look at our own culture and the way we've been shaped and the way we communicate, the better we're going to understand how to address people that we might be having some sort of disconnect with. So that goes into the communication strategy. So who carries more risk in this exchange and whose style takes more work? So for instance, there is one of the examples that I use typically is there's a Dutch male boss, cisgender male boss, um, and he is working with a woman from Morocco. So her, first language, or actually her third language is English. That's his second language. Then there's also, he is the boss, so there's a male-female power dynamic there. There's a communication dynamic, whereas typically in Morocco, trust and relationship building is really important, whereas in the Netherlands, it's more about egalitarian, and there's no real hierarchy, and there's also very direct feedback. If you know somebody that's Dutch, they're very direct. And so sometimes that can, cause some people to get offended. So it's really, really important to think through, like, who's in the room, who's interacting with each other, and what do they bring along with them into that room? Because we never come in a silo, we never come as a solitary identity. So all of these things. So she might have a little bit more risk in speaking up and explaining her thought process about something, or speaking up about some feedback. So maybe it's negative, maybe it's constructive criticism that she wants to give, but she's going to carry a little bit more risk than maybe her male boss would. So things like that. That goes back to that history, identity, and power. And then if we look at mobilization and engagement, who has permission to push back and what happens when they don't? So for instance, for my Chinese students, a lot of times as an American teacher, I was really into interaction and talking, and I was also used to the students not really respecting us as much. But in China, as a teacher, my students were very shy. They didn't speak up because they were respecting the hierarchy of me being the teacher. And it wasn't so much that their silence meant that they agreed with me or that they understood, which is something that was my mistake. I realized later through more cultural classes about the Chinese culture that I was thinking, well, they understand because they're not saying anything, but that's not the case. So there were times that they didn't understand. And so when I could see at assessment time, I was like, oh, they didn't understand anything I was saying. Why didn't they say anything? Because they were respecting the hierarchy. And so, in an American classroom, they might be more apt to say something like they don't understand. So that also goes along with mobilization and engagement. And then finally, what support, sustainability and reflection, what support takes weight off of someone rather than adding to it? So what can you do to create a more transparent, a more clear workplace, more clear communication style? Maybe you have some rules. A great thing that I'm going to be doing in September with one of my clients is talking about the generational shift and how do we create communication rules as a team so that this is for text, this is for email. Are we sharing, like even down to emojis? Emojis mean different things to different generations. You got to be careful with the emojis. So, my daughter usually will tell me like, no, mom, not that emoji. That's the wrong one. So even things like that is really helpful. Jargon is really helpful to know, generational jargon. So all of these things are important for us to get clear on as a team, as an organization. So we're going to do a couple things in practice. So any questions so far? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. All right. Okay, so one of the things that we might want to think about too is negotiations. So when we think about when you were a child, how did you negotiate? Do you have children now and do they try to negotiate with you? My daughter is an amazing negotiator. I think they learned it on TikTok. They are learning skills on TikTok that I'm unaware of. But already, like, oh my gosh, she's just negotiating like crazy. So, something that when we think about negotiating growing up, what did we notice about negotiations with our families, with our schooling? So, if we think about our family dynamic, how did we negotiate? How did we communicate? Then we go into the school dynamic and our friends and our peers. How did we negotiate and talk to one another? How did we communicate with one another? So as we get to the workplace, we carry all of that with us, all those things that we learned. So when somebody says, I'll take it back to my manager, that's not necessarily a yes. It can mean I heard you, or I have to ask, or, and sometimes some cultures don't want to say no. So, like in China, for instance, it was not a direct no. There was the roundabout no. And it used to like drive me crazy because I thought, well, I don't understand what's happening. But it was to save me from embarrassment. So it's called like saving face. And so I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before. And so a lot of this like saving face was to save me from embarrassment. They don't want to say no to me. So that's also what my students were doing. They wanted to respect the hierarchy. And so they didn't want to say, we don't understand you, because that would be disrespectful to me. So, and I'm thinking, no, I need that information. And especially as an American, we can be pretty direct. And we also, it has a lot to do with our history. So if you come from maybe a past dictator environment like the Portuguese, they were under dictatorship for 50 years. So for them to say no and to say something directly or to write it down would have gotten them in jail in the early 70s. They actually got freedom in 1974. So for a long time, to say something could actually land them in prison. That's true for a lot of different countries that was under the communist regimes or had a dictator of some sort. So that actually does shape the way that you negotiate, the way that you communicate, all of those things. So I might not necessarily get a direct no from someone. I might not also get the direct answer. Or somebody might not want to speak up because there might be more of a fear of what might come out of that. So yeah, absolutely, in the US as well. All right, so I'm looking at what everybody's saying too. Okay, so let's say we're negotiating and we want to say, I'll take it back to my manager. You hear this and you're like, what does that mean? And as an entrepreneur, sometimes with a client, they'll say, I'll take it to my manager. And you're like, I have no idea what's going to happen. And how much is the manager a decision maker? So who are the decision makers? So a couple things to ask yourself is, who else has to agree to this project before it's final? And who are the stakeholders? Who are the decision makers? And then what would make this a no? So if you're trying to get a yes or a no, ask for the no directly, especially if you're talking to somebody from a more indirect culture. It's easier to give than a yes. So for them, you can say, what do you need from me to get a yes or a no answer? Is there anything else that's like a deal, what we would say is a deal breaker? Also using idioms. So when I was an English language learner professor, I would teach my students how to teach, basically. And I would always tell them to avoid idioms, because if you're working with people where English is their second, third, or fourth language, using idioms doesn't always translate well, and they don't really understand necessarily what that is. So like you all probably heard during COVID, circle back. Everybody got really sick of hearing like, let's circle back. And that's like a corporate joke now, is when people say, "Oh, we'll circle back," or let's run this up the ladder, or things like that, um, or move the needle, or green light. Green light, actually, in Japan, they used blue lights. They had to change to blue lights because they didn't actually use green lights before, but because they wanted to be at least align with other countries, because if people were driving, they obviously wanted to use a green light if that's what they were used to. They actually made their lights a little bit more blue. So they kind of blended some colors to make a more blue light, which is almost towards the green light. So when you say things like, oh, let's green light this project, that might not mean the same thing for some people. Sports or religious analogies. The word tribe is super problematic. I know some people really like to talk about tribe. That is actually a Native American um, word that they need to use and nobody else. So that's something, that just like that kind of language. Sports analogies, don't always assume everybody understands sports or which analogies you're talking about. So World Cup, maybe everybody understands soccer or football better now. But American football, maybe not, or baseball, or golf or anything like that, those things can start to alienate and isolate some people if that's not something that they're familiar with. And then also, have I given this person a private way to disagree and not just a public one? So many times, in order to save face, they might tell you something in private, but they won't say it publicly in front of the whole group. So are you giving opportunities for people to share privately their feedback? And when you're negotiating, are you giving them some wiggle room to communicate with you in different ways, not just publicly, not just face to face? Some people need time to process. Can they come back to you in a day and have a written, can they text? Can they email? All of these different things are parts of the way that we communicate. Okay, let me see the chat. So now let's think about conflict. If you were, how many of you are conflict avoidant? Like, you don't like conflict? Put it in the chat, like avoid. Put in the chat, avoid if you're conflict avoidant, or like pro conflict, or okay, you're okay with conflict. So Eugene, you're not good with conflict. You're okay. Yeah, okay, great. How many of you are working on your conflict style? Okay, I'm going to look at what everybody's saying. I love this. The question, how are you usually treat interruptions? Ah, yeah, Allie, that's interesting about treating interruptions. Okay, interruptions. Let's talk about that real quick. If you think about like a French meeting, you might notice that the French are really good at collaborating and disagreeing. And there's many times if you go into a French meeting where there will be some interruptions, and that's not problematic. But that might be problematic for another culture or another team if that's not something that's already been talked about. So when we think about conflict, some people might view interruptions as conflict, and some people are like, no, that's just us talking. So that is something that needs to be named on teams, is how are we going to address conflict? What does that look like for our team? And these are all great like meetings and retreat types of things to do, but it's also just in the moment. If something comes up, like for instance, I was running a committee on diversity, equity, inclusion we were running these events. And what I noticed, I was one of the chair people, and I noticed that we were having a disagreement about offering another event for that quarter because we had already offered two, and the guys wanted to offer another one, and the women were saying no. And the guys kept insisting. And so they wanted to have a third event. We were saying no because we knew that a lot of that invisible work, the invisible labor, like the supplies, the papers, the arranging the tables, talking to the maintenance people, making sure we got the tables in the correct amount. Then we knew that another woman who was the assistant to one of the guys was going to have like double work, that she already had a lot going on. And so there was some stuff that we already knew. And as women, we already knew that typically we take care of the food and all of those little things. How many of you know what I'm talking about? So we knew that. And so I was trying to explain, as the leader of the group, I was trying to explain to the guys, like, okay, so I'm noticing that we are at a standstill here. What are we noticing right now? How are we divided? And, the women could understand, but the guys were like, what? I don't see how we're divided. I'm like, we're divided along gendered lines. And let me tell you what's happening with that and why that is. So I explained all of the invisible labor stuff. The guys typically would just show up to the meetings. We would be there, 15, 20 minutes early. Sometimes the guys would come late to our own event. So it took us about 5 months to resolve this conflict. And the guys called us dramatic. One of the guys called us dramatic. So that, of course, got all the women really mad. And I had to say again, I said, so the word dramatic has been used to put women in mental institutions, have been used to sideline women's voices, to call us emotional. It's a lot of that coded language. That means that your opinion is not valid. So to call us dramatic was really problematic. And he's like, well, I didn't know that. I'm like, I know you didn't. And so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I said, I know you didn't. but now you do. And just so you know that words have power. And so that was one way to address conflict. So sometimes when you are looking at a group, look at, is the silence disagreement, respect, or someone deciding it's not safe to speak? So some of the assistant for the guy did not feel safe to tell him that she didn't want to do another event. That's her boss. So that's a big power dynamic. Whose way of disagreeing gets called professional and who gets called difficult? We were being called dramatic. So that's difficult. That's coded as difficult. What would make disagreeing cost less? So could we write it down? Could we speak about it in private? How do we help people to express their opinions without it being too much of a risk for them? And then am I treating quiet as a yes because it's easier for me? And as a teacher in China, that was definitely easier. I could keep moving my curriculum. So let me see what everybody's saying. Yeah. So Eugene says they constantly interrupt each other. Yeah. Okay. So let's move into, this is the last one, then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. So some of you might be hiring or rolling out a big change that's happening in your company. So one thing that came from the cultural agility change model was change. And I was working here in Portugal, and there's a lot of startups here. The Web Summit is here, if you've ever heard of that. And there's a lot of startups, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people trying to do really interesting work. And they might be having people problems, or they might be trying to hire assistants or hire a team, and they're having trouble communicating. And so some of the things that might come up for you when you're hiring is you might hire people that interview the way that you do. So you might have somebody that is basically you're looking at yourself in the mirror. We have a tendency to do that as humans. We like to hire people that are similar to us. We don't, that's not something that we're meaning to do necessarily. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Um, it's just something that we feel comfortable with. So you might want to ask yourself, are we looking at how is this person interviewing? What are we really looking for? And so are we scoring them on how well they interview or how well she would do the job? What does culture fit mean? So if you always think about a culture fit and there's hidden rules, what does hidden rules mean? Um, does this person remind you of you? We talk about this with mentoring. You really want to mentor someone different than you because you want to give them a different perspective and you also need to get a different perspective. Gen Z is really good about reverse mentoring and seeing mentorship as multiple simultaneously beneficial. And the reason why and sometimes, as a Gen Xer, I always thought a mentor is somebody older and wiser, but that's not necessarily how mentoring is rolling out these days. So something else to think about. Whose experience does our job description actually describe? So if you think about your avatar for your job description, what is that? What are you hoping they bring to the table? And are you going to be okay if they bring new ideas? And that's sometimes we all say, oh, well, that's what we hope for. That's what we hope for. But is it really? Is it really what you hope for? Because sometimes they don't, it might not be safe for that person to ask questions. So are you providing an environment where they can ask questions, they can push back? Are you going to talk about that in the interview and what that might look like? Um, so also, self-promotion. So do our questions only work if you're raised to sell yourself? So Americans were really pretty good about self-promotion, but in Norway and Scandinavian countries, to talk about yourself is very frowned upon. To talk about, self-emulation or self-promotion is really frowned upon. And so that's something to think about. Let me see okay. And then change. So when we think about organizational change, this is another big one. So when we look at organizational change, we might have a rollout that lands in one country, stalls in another. So I've been working with a client. They have their headquarters is in Germany, but they also have offices in India, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Brazil, and they were having some issues with some of those cross-cultural communication. So that was really important for for them to address. They had this like multicultural center, but it wasn't really working out because they didn't really talk about the communication struggles they were having. And they didn't really come to a conclusion of how are we going to have like a communication protocol? How do we communicate with each other? Because what like somebody like Eugene said in the chat, if we're interrupting each other in Mexico, but in Germany it's one person speaks at a time, that's going to conflict, right? So you have to think about how we communicate and then how has change been rolled out. And so has there been change before at this company? How did it go? So, they were trying to repair something, but had they understood that that multicultural center probably needed to have some rules and needed to have some transparency with it first before they opened it up, they wouldn't have to go back and patch it back up and patch up those communication problems. So think about change. What change has this organization been through before? How did that work out for them? What did it cost them? How did people adapt to it or not adapt? Did people leave? I'm sure some of you have been on teams where you've had to kind of join teams or join organizations, and it was just like not working out, and people were just not understanding each other. Or they might say, that's not how we did it before. So, whose agreement did we get? And whose silence do we count as a yes? So, again, it's, some people don't feel comfortable speaking up about the change. So are we asking more of some teams than we are of others? Like what I said with the committee example, we're asking more of the women. There was more of that invisible labor work that the guys didn't really encounter. They didn't understand that part. So we have to ask ourselves those questions. And where has it landed differently than we expected? And what do we not know about the impact of this change? So you want to think about things from a preventive standpoint. So which of these is costing you most right now? Are you going through maybe a change with organizational, or is it like just a communication issue? Are we having a hiring issue? What's happening? And maybe it's something else. Maybe it's negotiation or conflict that you're also dealing with. I'm just looking at all right. So I think oh, Misty says I've learn to embrace friction. Pam says, I don't like conflict, but I hate unresolved conflict more. Oh my gosh, I know. Me too. Okay. I'm going to ask you this question and see what you all think, and maybe we can work this out together. So this is one for us to work through, and I'd like for you all to get off of mute if you'd like, and you can just start to chime in and ask questions as well. But let's first look at this, review. So, all right, nope. This is a performance review. So we have two managers, the same results. So one talks confidently about what they've achieved, and the other grew up where praising yourself was impolite and criticism is softened so nobody loses face. That might be called an indirect feedback culture. So she describes her work as the team's. So she doesn't always take, the responsibility herself. She doesn't say, well, I did this and I did, 25% better sales when I did that. Maybe that's not the way that they grew up culturally to talk about self-promotion and what I did. I know that's hard for me. And so I like to say, well, the whole team did it. It wasn't just me. It was the whole team. And so for this particular person, she might have been rated lower. And then you have AI coming in, and AI is reflecting what we're giving it, right? We're giving AI feedback. We're installing information into it. So it's taking our biases with us. So the AI summary of her feedback calls her less assertive. But for women, that's problematic. Like we're too assertive, we're not assertive enough. There's always some issue, right? So respond in the chat or get off of mute. What in this rating is about her work? And what is it about how she talks about her work? And then whose idea of a strong leader is this rating built on? So sometimes it feels riskier for someone to self-promote, or it just feels really uncomfortable. And is that what this, performance review, this manager, is that what they're looking for? And then if AI learned from our past rating, what is it repeating back to us? Oh, they don't. Okay. So reply in the chat. So Zoom webinars don't allow unmute, unfortunately. So I will kind of wait for you all in the chat. If you also have questions, you can ask. Yeah, Allie, you had said this comes up a lot when companies merge. That's exactly when it comes up. AI is definitely compromising review. In every presentation that I have been asked to give, I've had to give an AI component in the last year. Every single one that I've been doing, I have to talk about AI in some way. Every conference I go to, every webinar, they all are talking about AI and the impact of AI. So obviously we have to talk about it. Yeah, when a different CEO came on board. Yeah, AI sometimes helps and sometimes it doesn't at all. So if we were to look at some questions, right? Oh, okay. Misty says, not sure about her work. I think mostly about how she talks about is the teams, the males, and our biases. And then let me go back. So yeah, number one, not sure about her work. I think mostly about how she talks about it. So I was on a WhatsApp group and they were talking about creating a platform where people can go in and get like AI to generate their LinkedIn content because sometimes companies want to know what you're doing on LinkedIn and if you're promoting the company and the work that you're doing at the company. Some people are good about that, some people are not. Some people feel comfortable doing that on social media, some don't. And so that is something too, like, is she also putting her work out there on like public platforms? Maybe that's something that they're looking for. Whose idea of a strong leader is this rating built on? Yeah, it was, usually it's based on the ethos of the organization. So whoever really kind of started that organization and the structure that they built, the framing of that organization is going to trickle down to everyone. And so the communication patterns, the hierarchy, all of those things are going to put into play exactly how people are going to work and how they can, if they're supposed to self-promote or not, or too much self-promotion, not enough. I mean, it's always kind of hard to know, right? So you have to be really clear and transparent about that. So some questions to ask yourself is, okay, context awareness. So is modesty is how she was raised to talk about work. So it says nothing about what she delivered. She was just being modest. She was, raised that way, not to self-promote. Alignment and also being a woman too. Alignment and framing. Strong leader here quietly means visible and confident. So, if you say that out loud, what does a strong leader look like here? What do we all envision a strong leader is? And what does that look like? And then sustainability and reflection. How do we keep this going to where it's a sustainable practice? So what would let quiet deliverers, people that are quiet, be seen the next time during the year and not just in the last meeting? So can you put into place a communication strategy or a protocol for people to give their feedback without feeling like they're risking something or putting them on the spot? So if you think about what does your organization thinks as a strong leader, because a lot of that has to do with the way we view other people, especially around performance reviews. So everybody take a quick screenshot of this. And you can go back to this later, but this is a quick inventory for you. So where do you fit, would you say? And if you don't understand all of it, that's okay. This is a lot of information. I know that. The professor in me has to give you all of it. The ADHD and the professor in me has to give you all the information. So I also, on my website and other resources I have, I can always give you more. But this is like a great thing to take a screenshot of and to come back to it and really think about it. In the meantime, Allie says, I'm researching the bias of AI in judging women's work. Oh, yes. But here's another twist. If a man and a woman submit a project, the managers attribute more of the women's work to her use of AI than they do the men's work, even if the conclusions and support are the same. So the managers attribute more of the women's work to her use of AI. Oh, so are they saying that she's using AI more than the men are? Managers attribute more of the women's work to her use of AI than they do men's work. Hmm. So do we have other questions? Does this resonate for some of y'all? Is there anything that you're like, oh man, I hadn't thought about that? Or, oh, I probably should think about that more. Yeah, Eugene, the one thing I love about this idea of a kaleidoscope is that there's so much to each of us. And some of the issues that I've had about just looking at one identity, like race, gender, like as a silo, or age, or health, or ability, is that we're not just one of those things. We're all of these things, and these identities change over time. And so to me, a kaleidoscope really captures that. And that cultural agility is really about understanding that we are all working within these kaleidoscopic identities and that we can change our perspective and we can ask questions. Something that I always say to everybody is to ask more questions. You know, if you feel like you're having a misalignment with somebody, just ask them more questions. Tell me more. You know, can you clarify for me what you mean by that? So, you know, the more questions you ask, the more you're probably going to understand what's at the foundation and what's at the root. Fascinating, disturbing, not necessarily. They're essentially saying she needed the help. Ah, and men have made their decisions based on bona fide research and analysis. Allie, wow. Wow. Okay, especially with the women doing more of the work than a man with the same title. Yeah. And this is great. What would you say about how women process clarity in a culture of silence as a response? What would you say what would you say about how women process clarity in a culture of silence as a response? I think that I know that I have been told I was too quiet before. And for me, it was like my day one of the job, and I get super quiet. Like I listen a lot, and I've always been told that's what you should do is listen a lot, listen first. But then when I was in the meeting on day one, they were like, "Well, we wanted to hear from you more." I'm like, "It was day one." I was like, "I'm listening. I'm absorbing the culture." I felt like it was presumptuous for me to start talking and giving my opinions to a brand new team that I just met. So, um, I'm against silence. Performance should be for everyone when doing reviews. I hate that everyone gets an increase when a coming does not do merits. Yeah, so hopefully I answered about the question from chat. What does an effective repair look like after cultural misread has already damaged trust? Ooh, great question. Okay, so we've got 4 minutes, so I'm going to answer this. I'm going to put I want you to think about this because what I'm about to say might help you with your one thing I'm taking into my work week is, and I know it's Tuesday, so you just have a few more days. But a cultural misread, the best thing you can do, and I've done this 1,000 times because I used to do anti-racist training in Seattle. And so as a white person doing DEI work, this was something that I did all the time. I stepped in it constantly. So something is, again, ask questions. So like, let's say I might have said something that whether I think it was good or not, I might say, you know, my intention was this. I'm wondering what the impact on you was when I said this. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you need from me in this particular scenario or this situation? Can you tell me a little bit more about this project or your experience with this project or something like that? So as you're asking questions, ask them open-ended questions that allows them to elaborate more. I was with when I was a professor, a lot of times to be a first author on something is a negotiation with the other people doing the work if you're working with a lot of different people. And the order of who's on the article is really important. So whoever's first obviously is the one that spearheaded the whole project. And if you're going up for tenure and promotion as a professor, you need to be the first author. So that can be a really tenuous time. So you might ask somebody like, how important is this to you to be, first author? Or how important is this to you to be blah, blah, blah? And that gets them to tell you a little bit more about what they need from you, because sometimes people don't already know what they need. They might need to be asked some questions. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you ask more questions and you're pulling out of people a little bit more of what's at the root of the issue. And so, I mean, I have cultural conflicts. I had one today with a Portuguese vet. Um, you know, we can't get into it, but if you want to talk to me later about it, I'll tell you the story. But I was like, every day, it's something. And so think of it this way, think of it as a curiosity aspect and not something that you need to avoid, and just get curious. And sometimes you have to put your ego to the side to really understand what's at the heart of that miscommunication. So I want to be mindful of your time. But this is a feedback, and I'll stick around a little bit for questions, or if you want to email me, or I have a newsletter on LinkedIn that's for cultural agility, so I talk about this all the time. But I would love your feedback. If you want to check out our book, we also talk about that in the book. From Sabotage to Support, we talk a lot about identity, and especially around women, and how women sometimes sabotage each other along these cultural lines and what that looks like. So let me see if there's any other questions. I've
Joy,
just finished my books.
it's really, really valuable. And thank you all to for everyone who joined today. We'll send this recording and the recap out with your QR and the links and all of that great stuff out tomorrow. So we
Great.
appreciate it. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.